position regarding the matters that we talked about. It would be very helpful if you cover today. So George, when you're ready, on you go.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm George Dean. I'm one of 12 directors, volunteer directors of the Islay Energy Trust. We've a good spread of directors, and very little happens in Islay that we don't get to know something about. A few words about the trust. It was established in 2004. Its primary aim is to generate renewable energy and carbon savings projects for the benefits of the communities, and that's important aspect. We've worked in pretty well all sectors of the renewables area. We've built a project, and we're in regular contact with lots of consultants and developers. Next slide, please, Paul. Thanks. So why is energy important for us? As you've heard, we are a substantial consumer of energy, around about 250 gigawatt hours per annum. 10% of that's electricity. If you say we want to electrify things, you could roughly say we need 10 times more electricity than we have. But bringing electricity brings other opportunities in terms of efficiency and so on. As you've also heard, the fuel oils are imported. When a subsea cable fails, and the one from the mainland to Jura has failed twice in the last 5 years, we rely on diesel generation, 6 megawatts worth of it in Beaumore, which itself, of course, is a contributor to increasing fuel oil consumption locally. We've been supported to some extent by local renewables. On Islay, we're fairly limited. There's about a megawatt of capacity between the community wind turbine, which is the largest, plus some solar installations and hydro. And of course, there's a substantial hydro scheme in Jura, 2 megawatts, which, as long as the subsea cable from Islay to Jura remains whole, it last failed 10 years ago, then that mitigates some of the diesel generation required. And of course, the issue is that we are surrounded by tidal and wind energy resources, and there has to be a way of doing something about that. So the next slide, please. So there's no easy or short-term solution, and we have a big effort required to engage all aspects of the community and gain their support. What we've been working on is trying to establish a long-term vision and explain that vision to the community and work out the steps to get from here to there. The one thing that can happen in the short run and should be a constant focus is really trying to ensure that energy efficiency and insulation schemes are maintained and developed as far as possible. In the long run, we think electricity will be the major part of the solution, and that will be allied to storage, be it batteries or hydrogen or whatever, and we'll talk about that later. And the main options for local generation are clearly tidal and offshore wind. The scope for further onshore wind here is relatively limited due to the presence of SSSIs, bird population, an airport in the middle of the island, and so on. And of course, if we can actually generate more locally, then that can avoid fairly substantial, in fact, you might call it massive grid reinforcement if we were to continue to import energy. The next one, please. Just a word about tidal. IET actually started work on the Sound of Islay with Robert Gordon's University 15 years ago, and there still hasn't been a kilowatt hour generated. There have been developers who've secured leases, but nothing has followed through. We've tried to figure out how to do some community scale projects, and indeed have made a couple of applications to the Crown Estate. We haven't been successful as yet, but we continue, and will continue to continue until we actually get something done. Economics of tidal are still problematical, but there is the hope that sometime later this year, in the next Contracts for Difference round, there may be some ring-fence support for tidal. It's not the best thing in the world to have external support, but unless you can actually get a development underway and begin the learning process of reducing costs, then it needs that to kickstart it. We only have to see what's happened with the cost structure for offshore wind over recent years. So on Tidal, maybe we can imagine something like 10 megawatts could be developed over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. So still a reasonable way away, but all feasible. Next one, please, Paul. Offshore wind. Those of us who have been here will remember there was an attempt to develop an offshore wind project 10 years ago. This was due west of Islay. The developer didn't handle the process particularly well. Protest group was formed, and that wasn't an auspicious way to try and deal with a project of the scale that was envisaged. But now we have a site slightly more to the northwest of Islay. Number of developers, I think 5 altogether, have been in contact with us seeking our input. Some of these have taken the matter very seriously. All of them, we've said, if you want to be loved by the island, you've got to land a proportion of the generation here. And that might be up to 10%, depends on the size of that, that wind farm, but we need probably of the order of 50 to 80 megawatts of generation capacity to satisfy what will be required for decarbonisation. As has been mentioned, the direction of travel for electricity supply is towards localisation. In Westminster, there's a bill, local electricity bill, going through Parliament with the object of figuring out how local organisations can benefit from local generation. And so our view is we should plan for a new grid and try and make it locally owned, because that's the way to do it. Try and generate an electricity supply company locally and ally that to storage solutions, hydrogen electrolysis and the like. And then find a way of providing a direct supply to major users. And we still have to collaborate with the district network operator, SSE in this case. But there's an opportunity there, and it was interesting to hear the Minister describe that may well be something that's in the thinking. To get to this stage, that's maybe 7 years away, it's maybe 8 years away. But the planning of it is complicated and will require a huge amount of effort. And as soon as a developer is awarded the site West 1, then that's when the work has to start. Now, the process, the ScotWind process, has been delayed a little bit. We don't know how long it's going to be delayed for, but the sooner it's resolved and the sooner that decision is taken, then this major activity can follow. The next one, please. I just say a little bit about transport. We've only a handful of electric vehicles, but until such time as we've got a reliable supply of renewable electricity, there is no justification for promoting electric vehicles here as a decarbonising issue. People may want electric vehicles for other reasons. 1 day of diesel generation at Beaumore is 40 to 50 cars worth of fuel per annum. 1 day. And on the last 2 occasions when the subsea cable has failed, it's been out for 4 months on each occasion. Heavy transport and agricultural equipment, unlikely to use batteries. Maybe that's where hydrogen come in at some stage in the future. The so-called ABE process, acetone, butanol, ethanol process being developed by Celtic Renewables. If that's economic, maybe we could have a biobutanol plant here and provide a diesel substitute. And that would use some of the distillery draff and pot ale. We can't comment on what happens to the Calmac ferry and so on. So next slide, please. On the subject of our economy, the gross value added of the Islay economy is around £90 million per annum. If we take the distilling sector and the associated transport and tourism, which has increased fairly substantially over whisky tourism over the last few years, that's around about 50% of that gross value added. And it is probably growing as a proportion. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know that may have some inherent vulnerability. So we really need to find out how we're going to diversify this economy. A local energy company would eliminate the imports, that's £12 million worth, and then therefore have the opportunity to generate some new gross value added. And if we can make it locally owned, it will provide community benefit too. But I can't go past saying we need to bring our infrastructure up to scratch. We're short of housing, our roads are desperate, connectivity is poor, transport links are an issue, grid reliability is an issue. So the final slide, please, Paul. So what do we want? And well, the local energy policy published in January is a very commendable document. It starts with talking about people and places, and so will we. We just have to start there and develop people to explain and advise and support the community and local businesses what that policy means. Argyll and Bute Council published a decarbonisation plan also in January, and there's the rural growth deal that we've heard about. Let's figure out how to use that decarbonisation plan and the rural growth deal to deliver the vision. I'm absolutely sure all distilleries both need and want to decarbonise. The timings will vary and the options may vary, but we hope that, and we believe that they would support community plans. And back to households, they need tailored advice. There are a lot of government schemes and they're very welcome, but they're largely centralised. I think we ought to aim to localise these and incorporate support for measures targeted on what the local needs are. And at the end of it all, let's try and make our islands an exemplar of a model locally led energy system. Thank you, Paul.
Well, George, thank you. Look, we've got time for a couple of questions here, and I want to focus on, I think, an appropriate word in that I think you are a veteran of energy on Ireland and trying to get it organised. So you've got a different perspective to what many people have, and you were guarding it carefully if you have been frustrated in the recent past. So congratulations on that. But do you see a better landscape, whether it's regulatory or financial future, where more can be achieved, or do you think the frustrations will continue? How do you see that? Is this a propitious moment in the future of Ireland's energy strategy?
Thank you, Paul. I may be a veteran by being old.
No, I didn't mean that.
I'm not.
I very carefully chose my words.
I have been involved with the Energy Trust for 12 years, so I'm reasonably familiar with what's what. The regulatory situation is, of course, complicated. The electricity market is highly regulated, but it has to change, and it will change by localization and local control. The planning issues surrounding all these things are complicated and difficult. It took us 5 years to get a site for our community wind turbine and get planning permission for it. There is a lot of bureaucracy, and one understands why there's a lot of bureaucracy, but we have to try and figure out how to cut through that bureaucracy as effectively as we can. Is this a propitious moment? Yes. Can we deliver these things? Yes. Will it take a lot of time and energy? Absolutely yes. But that's why we need a vision and a long-term plan.
The rural growth deal and the opportunities that come from that, is that likely to crystallize a more coherent, broader strategy of what needs to be done? Or has that strategy just been in there in the past, just hasn't been implemented?
Well, I think we've all had the idea that tidal energy should work here, but we haven't actually been able to deliver it. It's only going to be a part of the solution, and right now there is a bit of a risk that offshore wind will perhaps overtake tidal because it will be more cost effective. But that doesn't stop us wanting to get tidal development done, because it's invisible, it's predictable, and it should perhaps command a premium price by virtue of that. There are issues around wind turbines, but there are issues around climate change as well, and the community has to figure out which is the right direction of travel.
Okay, well, a question that I was going to ask one question, but I just see Sam has come in with a slightly different question, so I'll ask that. But you've argued and advocated in your comments about the broad benefits of a locally owned grid energy system. The question is, what do you think is the best way to initiate a locally owned grid and electricity supply company? What's the best way to do that? That's the question we're asked.
Thank you, Sam, for throwing me that curly one. The regulations allow for what it's called license light at the moment in terms of forming local electricity supply companies, but it remains complicated. But the best way to do it is to recognize, firstly, that the scale of increase in electricity generation and consumption is massively greater than what we currently do. And therefore, it requires, let's call it a radical or an imaginative solution to deliver that. Now, I attended yesterday SSE's stakeholder engagement meeting on the next round of planning, ED2, and they did not indicate, this was specifically to deal with the islands, they did not indicate any plans for any substantial increase in supply or capacity for Islay. And the grid is presently constrained. So I think we would be helping the district network operator by actually creating a new plan and a new structure to add alongside theirs. That would seem to me a doable deed.
Okay, and in the sort of minute we've got left, are there any things in your mind, George, as you were listening to the minister speaking, where you thought, well, I'd like to comment on that from a local perspective to a Holyrood perspective, but you can't have half an hour?
Well, I think looking at this from the domestic consumer's point of view, there are a lot of schemes available, but they don't cover things like doors and windows, which are heat leaks for lots of people. So our own community benefit fund has a section within that to try and support people to do these things. Now, what I would like to see is that the currently largely centralised activities of Home Energy Scotland could become more localised, because people here and people on most islands, they'll deal with people locally. It's not so easy for them to deal with people centrally. So decentralise some of these activities and broaden the scope of the support that's required by looking specifically at the measures that individuals need. The coal burners, for example, there are around 300 households in Islay burning coal. They're going to need individual help. And that's best delivered by local people.
Thank you very much, George. That's been excellent. We're now going to finish that